This is Carrie Getz, and welcome to another edition of our podcast series, Careers for Women Trades and Vets in Tech and Data Centers. Today, we have Sara Martin with us. Hey, Sara, introduce yourself.
Thanks, Carrie. I'm Sara Martin. I'm with HED, which is a national architecture and engineering company. I have a background in architecture, but I went straight into the data center world for my first job out of college, and I've been in here since. While my background's in architecture, I went straight into project management, and I kind of picked the data center industry because I was interested in the more technical side of architecture and getting involved with the engineering side of things. My family's very engineering based. I do woodworking as a hobby, so it's kind of a best case scenario, right, where it's more the technical and the implementation and really how do you get down to the bolts of it all and how everything goes together, and you know a little bit less of the beautiful stuff sometimes, but it's still cool from a coordination standpoint and trying to make sure it fits together well and all that kind of stuff.
Awesome. So, yeah, I think I started out in architecture too, by the way.
I
Funny
didn't
how
know
that
that.
works. But most
Yep.
people in this industry fell into this industry. They didn't, there wasn't an ambition where they started out and said, hey, I'm going to be in the data center world, unless they happen to know somebody in data centers that
Right.
kind of brought them into the fold at an early age. Matter of fact, most of the time when I speak to students, if you say how many people know what a data center is, if one person raises their hand, who do you know in a data center? My dad, there's normally a connection. So how did you end up in the data center industry?
So, I college, I kind of got burnt out towards the end. And so, like I mentioned, my family has engineering side of things. So I knew I had a architecture degree, right? So I was going somewhere in the architecture world trying to figure that out. And then I kind of came across Integrated Design Group is what our company was called back then. And I saw the data center side of things, was more interested in, hey, if this has a technical component of it and I get to learn kind of how these systems work, maybe that's be something I'm interested in. So I kind of got lucky in that sense of I kind of stumbled upon the industry, and then the more I learned and the more I understood how all of it worked, the more I got interested in it, and kind of I started running projects that were MEP based pretty early on. So that was to me very intriguing because it was like architecture school, a lot of times you get taught, not to say that MEP doesn't matter, but it's sometimes there is that side of things where the architects govern, right? And
Sure.
so to me, it was a nicer or a integrated design approach, which is something I gravitate towards. I'd rather have a building that completely functions together. It's not just, one discipline gets to choose versus the other. So, long way to say, I somewhat fell into it. And I actually your book, I wish existed at that point in time, and that's not even a plug because you had mentioned, in one of your talks about you were doing research on the books that existed. One of the books that you brought up was like I don't know, 600, 1,000 page book
800
or whatever.
pages. Yeah.
Yeah. And I looked at it when I started because I was like, I need something to try to understand all these abbreviations, all this stuff. And then I looked at that and I was like, I'm never gonna read that. Like it's not gonna get me anywhere. So I skipped over that. But yeah, your book does a far better job of giving you the intro and trying to understand all the bits and pieces of a data center very
Oh,
quickly.
well, thanks. I think, well, I do. You talked about this functioning environment, and that really is what a data center is, right? It's that ecosystem of all the things and how all the pieces and parts fit together. And I think people that understand that and understand how the pieces and parts fit together do better in the industry, right? Because you're
Right.
involved in more conversations. Without sitting there like a deer in the headlights, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's part of what part of the reason I went to architecture school is that I like problem solving. And so adding the MEP component to the architecture is one of the things that really kind of caught my interest because it's not just, okay, how do I make this space pretty? It's how do I make this space functional and, be the most efficient mechanical system, or, hey, we need to put our electrical rooms here because you'll cut down on your feeder lengths and et cetera. So it's a lot more, factors that you have to kind of consider and really understand to be able to kind of build this typology.
But that's really where the industry's growing. And to me, I think honestly, that's where the fun is in the industry because it's a continuous cycle of learning. There's, the stuff we used 5 years ago, it'll be back in about 3 more years in a slightly different format. I feel like there's an 8 to 10 year cycle of stuff repeating itself in a new improved manner in this industry,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But it does, it functions very differently than, say, if you were to design a house and put an HVAC system in the house, right? That's a pretty fixed deal. There's not a whole lot of variables. There's not a lot that changes, but there definitely is in the data center industry, from low density solutions to high density solutions and kind of everything in between. So how did you, since the 800-page book was the only thing out there at the time, how did you get some of your knowledge? Talk about your learning process, because that's one thing that I really stress when I talk to people that are from outside of the industry, is that this is one of the longest ongoing apprenticeship programs there is out there, right? Because we don't have curriculum, so we all have to learn from each other. Even if you have a degree in architecture, you probably didn't study data centers in architecture school, right? So,
Yeah.
so talk about kind of how you jumped into that learning cycle and figured out what all you needed to know.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I kind of did a lot of MEP projects initially. So I did a whole lot of, you sat next to the engineer and you asked him a million questions. And at the time, I was probably, the person that kind of drove him crazy in a little bit. But at the same time, like I can't I can't stress enough the value of finding those mentors, right? I did everything I could to kind of counterbalance of like, hey, I'm going to ask you a million questions, but this is going to mean that we have a better product in the end, and I'm going to make sure that you have all the information you need. And I chase down all these things, but I'm also going to try to be there with you to understand it and not just kind of sit there and wait for you to tell me what to do type of thing. But I had a great electrical engineer and mechanical engineer on my team that we worked on countless amount of projects together at the time, and I can't tell you how many late nights I sat next to, like, electrical engineer, and I was like, "So what is an RPP? And what is," and just asked all those questions, and I mean, to some level, it's the same thing. You kinda have school in your back pocket, right? Where you hear something from a professor and you write it down and then you go Google it because you had no idea what that meant. It's the same kind of mentality, and I think the thing that I didn't know at the time but has been, very helpful more recently is kind of building the community from even outside of your work. So, I mean, I think you're heavily involved in a lot of the community from getting people inside the industry. But I think if you can find like a local chapter of 7 by 24, or even just reaching out to people through LinkedIn and whatnot, there's plenty of people in the industry who want to continue to grow the industry and they want to get you involved. So don't be afraid to ask the dumb questions. Dumb questions is what's going to make you be the person who knows everything at the end of the day, but you got to ask them early on type of thing.
Well, for sure. And I mean, we're all ignorant till we know, right? So I mean, everybody's on equal
Right.
footing there. And
Right.
everybody that knows, somebody taught them, or they figured
Exactly.
it out, or but this is a
And
very giving industry. The people in this industry are probably some of the best. And I was a consultant for a long time, so I was around a lot of different industries. But I gotta say, as a whole, the data center industry is some of the most genuine, kind, giving people that I've ever worked with. So what are
yeah.
some of the things that you've seen change? I mean, you've had kind of well, compared to me, you've had a really short career, but so what are some of the things that you've changed, and some of the things that kind of how you've involved in your role as a project manager and with the company and some of your growth? What's the stuff that really kind of has contributed to your growth?
I think like you mentioned before, it's a lot of the same, right? Where it's you go through these trends. I think right now we're in a another kind of speed up factor right now, right? With AI, everything is kind of booming, right? And that's not to say that that didn't happen previously, because it did. I mean, even like I want to say it was like 5 years ago now, a lot of the multi-tenant data centers went from like 1200 kW data halls to 6 megawatt data halls within like a year, right? And that
Yep.
instantly drove growth significantly. And now I think you're going to be looking at a very similar thing. I think what is going to be very interesting about this though is we're kind of at a tipping point within the industry, right? There's not enough power to supply the demand, right? And the reality that like lot in Virginia, right? One of the biggest areas for data centers doesn't have the power to supply what people want to build there. I think you're going to continue to see a lot more of that. So it's going to be, while in the past we've had all that growth, we might have more factors that we now have to deal with within that, right? So you'll see the power side of things. Do we start looking at different different potential power sources, right? Are we utilizing nuclear facilities that aren't necessarily providing to the grid right now? Is that a way that we can kind of offset the power demand on our grid? And then same concept for cooling, right? As we we continue to grow the capacity per rack, we now need to look at different ways to offset that. So liquid cooling has kind of been a topic for, I don't know, 10 years now. And now it's starting to hit that point of, okay, well, if you're really going to start talking about 300 kW per rack, that's not an air cooled solution, right? So what does that look like? What does that actually mean for our data centers in general? I mean, it was kind of funny, like you mentioned before, of, there's things in other, if it's a house, right? It's going to be a certain floor to ceiling height pretty much everywhere. I was in a liquid cooling seminar this past week, and they were talking about immersion cooling and how that's like a 4 foot container, and how that can potentially reduce your floor to ceiling height. And one of the guys in the crowd goes off and he's like, "Oh, well, no, you're always going to need a certain height." And I'm sitting there being like, we're talking about a 22 slab to slab ceiling down to like maybe a 16 slab to slab. That's a very big difference. Like, that's not a, I think you're missing the mark here on the guy who's going off on it. And it's just like, there's going to be a lot of those types of factors that I think, as the technology kind of comes out and we start going, okay, this is where this makes sense, this is where this doesn't make sense, you're going to start seeing play with those types of things where it's okay, our room doesn't need to be as big anymore, but we still have the mechanical system that is going to take up X amount of space for air cooled for a certain portion of it, and then liquid cooled for another. What does that do for your square footage? Those types of things. So I think it's going to be a lot of the same things that we always talk about, but it's kind of on a larger scale and larger, even though the footprint might actually be smaller, but larger scale in the megawatt standpoint and from a cooling kind of innovation standpoint.
Well, it'll be smaller until they use it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There was a guy, Parkinson, I think. He had wrote a white paper and used him years ago, but he had a couple laws. One was for storage and one was for networking bandwidth. And pretty much he said if you put it out there, they'll fill it up. And I think
Yep.
we're seeing that even with data centers nowadays. If you put it out there, it's going to get filled up pretty quickly. And the part that we're missing that across the board is that we're not teaching people how to be better consumers. And we're contributing to our own problems, I think, with a lot of our platforms, because we are the currency to these platforms, right? We're all of our metadata is what they use and farm and trade on. But I do think that as cool as some things are, we've got a ways to go with some of this technology, both from a facility standpoint and even IT kit. I mean, I've been playing around with AI just to see what it'll do, and some of it's great, and some of it's horrible, like
Yeah.
legitimately horrible. I
Yeah.
was I was looking through some stuff yesterday and put something in there about, because I'm working on a children's book, to get some ideas for illustrations and stuff. And when I put in girl, the girl was scantily clad pinup in every single picture. And I was like, okay, well, that's not going to work for a children's book. And now I'm scared somebody's going to come after me.
Right.
Right. So I think that we have a lot to learn how to use these tools so that we work for technology. And to me, those debates I think are great when you talk about, well, we're going to change this, right? 4 foot different ceiling height is a big difference. But there's some people in this industry that once they learn one fact, they will carry that fact to the grave, and there is
Yeah.
no disputing that fact because we're risk averse. So
Yeah.
talk about how you kind of deal with that in these projects. Like, I know there's times where things come up because no project goes 100% smoothly, but how do you deal with some of those trying to change people's mind? Because I know that comes up for a lot of women.
Yeah, it's funny, like everything you just said all comes down to education, right? Like just from I wholeheartedly agree with you on the, educating people on um where the users, right? You want to have less data centers. Okay, well, do you want to get rid of your Netflix? Do you want to get rid of your TikTok? Because we can talk about these things, but that's the reality of this at the end of the day. Um, so yeah, I think bringing awareness to a lot of the stuff is unbelievably important. But then specifically when it comes to clients, that's ultimately what it comes down to, and it usually is sometimes you can get it done in the bigger phone call, right? But to your point, sometimes sometimes with women conversations. There are situations where it has to be a pull them aside and kind of, not to say walk them through it, but to some level educate them
But
with it on behind the scenes, and then sometimes you can change their minds. We see it a decent amount with, like, I mean, I had a client uh at the time tell me that we had to do something, and I told him, hey, that's not that's not per code, you can't do that. And that 180 changed his opinion on me, and from then on out we were good, because it was, oh, you brought something to the table from the
you
code
brought the
perspective. Okay,
receipts. Yeah,
okay, yeah.
absolutely.
So to some level, it's a lot of that stuff. I would say that it's it's going to be continuously a difficult conversation, and to the kind of larger audience of these types of conversations, if you are a young woman in the industry, don't give up easily. It's not. It's sometimes you'll get that pushback, but it's not a personal thing. It's not a you thing. It's call one of the other women in the industry, and they'll give you the pep talk, because we've all been through it. But there's, I think, as a lot of the technology changes, as a lot of the regulations changes, there's going to be more of those conversations, which is going to be a little bit difficult for everybody, not just young women in the industry. Because I mean, even like we've run into situations on lithium ion, and the code around lithium ion is heading in the direction that I think a lot of people don't want to go, because there is fire hazards around it, and code is catching up to that. And so it becomes a, okay, well, are the data centers that are currently designed going to meet the codes that are going to be coming out, which is fine for historical data centers, but a lot of our clients basically run off of prototypes, right? So now what does that do to your prototype, and what does that do to your design moving forward? So it's a lot of those conversations where it's trying to give them a heads up, trying to make them understand, and then unfortunately when, they either get on board, they don't get on board, and then when it comes down to it, you go, okay, well, this is what it has to be, this is what it doesn't have to be, and kind of. And I will say that one thing that works in my favor a lot is I'm not the technical person at the end of the day. I'm the person who asks all the questions to understand it. So it's easy for me to translate pretty quickly, because I'm not the one who has to speak to it from the mechanical or electrical kind of weeds of it all. So that's another thing that kind of helps, of if you can if you can turn a data center into a dumbed down, analogy, people are way more willing to understand it, and kind of walk through it with you. So if you can kind of do that for your clients too, depending on their expertise, it helps a lot from a just kind of getting on their level with it, and making them understand the implications of it long term.
I think that's kind of just a smart thing to do in general practice. You have to meet people where they understand and help people, because not everybody learns the same way, not everybody
Right.
assimilates information the same way. And sometimes it is a matter, but that's really where it benefits working with people in the industry, because people in the industry follow those code implications, and when you go to trade shows they talk about those things, so that you realize it's happening before it bites you, and making sure that you work with people that are help writing those codes and standards, because I mean, there's, for some of these products, there's 18-month lead times, and you might have a design that's approved, and then you're not meet code as soon as you start going under construction, because it changed somewhere in
Right.
between, and you're expected, because it's in the build cycle, to build to that code. So
Right.
I think those are great conversations. And I think too that this industry is so much more accepting of women than it was when I started. And a lot of that's just, and I don't think, I mean, obviously there are some people that are just not good people, and that's across the board in any walk of life. But I think for the most part, it wasn't that it wasn't us against them. I think it was a perceived just by numbers, because there were so few of us, and there's more of us now. So we have that base, and we all work to support each other. So, to your point, absolutely. If you're not in a right fit, or even if you just want to figure out what the situation is and bounce it off somebody else, do that before you make an assumption, because honestly, those assumptions can be really deadly in your career for no good reason.
Right. Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree. Of the industry's gotten a lot better. I mean, even since I started going to shows and stuff, the diversity across the board has gotten better. I think obviously we all have progress to be made in pretty much every industry, right? But I think we're moving in the right direction. It's just a matter of trying to make sure we maintain people in the industry, that we continue to build the diversity in the industry.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of work, but I think, the majority of the work, honestly, that I see that's been fruitful has really been grassroots. It's,
Yeah.
people reaching out to other people, walking up to somebody you don't know at a trade show. Hey, you're new. Can I introduce you? Or let me introduce myself, those kind of things. I mean, those really go a long way, I think. So if you're not going to networking events, go introduce yourself. Start with
Right.
the local ones. They're usually pretty small and easy unless you happen to be in like Loudoun County where they're massively huge.
Where they're
But
always
for the
massive.
most part,
Yeah.
but you'll still find people you can talk to there, right?
Yeah.
That will
And the
introduce you around to the industry. So there are definitely a lot of resources for that.
and the,
So
the group
talk
in Loudoun
about kind
is
of
very nice.
you've been project managing now for how many years?
9 years.
9. So that's a pretty good time. So from when you started to where you are now, what would you say is your biggest accomplishment in your career?
Um,
Like if you decided I did something amazing.
so the thing that I'm the most proud of is a client that I brought in, but of course they're a client that I can't name names.
Of
Um,
course.
I for that one for me was a good one because it kind of followed some of my fundamentals and what I believe in from a project management side of things. I very much believe that if you have a partnership with your clients and you develop the relationship and you work to understand what their goals are, what their needs are from a client perspective, right? Because it's not just the PM themselves goals; it's also the bigger picture client and what are the things that they're up against and what do they have to kind of navigate internally so that you can be better in alignment as a consultant. Um, then that kind of turns into reoccurring work, right? And so this was a situation where I had worked on a client for a decent amount of time, had a really good relationship with them. They brought us in to work with their tenant because they trusted our basically the methodology that I just described there.
Right.
And then that tenant came back to us and was like, "Hey, we'd like for you guys to do work for us." So
Nice.
for me, it was
Nice.
it was rewarding because it was kind of something that I like really believe in. Like I really believe in the partnership relationship and being able to build from there. And sales is always going to be what it is, right? There's different ways to do it, different approaches, and whatever makes you successful, that's great. But for me, I'd rather not take the used carsman sales approach, the more
Sure.
extreme side of things. I'd rather build the partnerships. So to be able to have the partnership succeed and then bring in more was just it was a it was a nice moment. It was
Nice.
my
And
my
this is
favorite moment.
definitely one of those industries where those partnerships and those business relationships matter because, a lot of products have long lead times. It changes rapidly. There's, anything can go wrong and it is definitely mission critical. So those partnerships are what are going to carry you through. If you just go through buying the cheapest stuff all the time from whoever there are, if there's a bad situation, you kind of got nobody to call.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, even that's like the today, right? But then tomorrow, you never know who's gonna end up somewhere else. And so, uh, while we've grown as an industry, we're still a pretty small industry, and the more you can build those relationships and know that you're kind of a trusted source, the better off you'll be long term because you've got a bunch of people rooting for you in the corner type of thing.
Well, and it's also, you talked about mentoring and we talked a little bit about networking, but that's also a way that you could give and take with your network too. You can help
Right,
bring their solutions to the table. You should always surround yourself with other people that do similar things or that you can, that are related to your job so you have those resources. Because, at that point is account control too, right? You're
right.
being that resource. And that's what people want at the end of the day, the easy button.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
we are bumping up on time here. So if you wanted to leave everybody with some words of wisdom, what would you have to say?
Get involved with the data center industry because we're the best. No,
There you go.
I think it's a great industry to be in. I think, as we've talked about, community is a huge thing. The individuals in this industry are a great resource, but we're also a great group of individuals to kind of help grow your career. If you have any interest in the the industry, it's definitely worth even reaching out to people on LinkedIn. People are responsive and will get back to you on, hey, I may not be the right person for you to reach out to, but try reach out to so and so. We all kind of know each other and we will try to help. That happened to me last week and help someone else get in touch with a person more local to get our setup in some of the local events. So it's definitely worth doing. And it's great to, like I said, it's a great industry to be in. Reach out if you need anything. I'm Sara Martin at HED on LinkedIn, and I'll more than welcome to help.
And of course, your contact information will be in the description of this podcast. And for those of you listening, we certainly appreciate your time. If you have any other questions for Sara or myself, you know how to get in touch with us. And until next time, have a great holiday, actually. Take care.
Thanks, Carrie.